Hi, scholars. For Read Aloud today, we're going to read Chapter 8 of Charlotte's Web by E.B. White. But first, we need to go over character perspective. It is what a character thinks or believes to be true about another character, the conflict, or a moment in the text. When you're looking for evidence, you need to always ask yourself, what did the character do? What did the character say? And how does the character feel? You're going to look for text evidence today according to our two big ideas. The two characters we're going to focus on today is Mrs. Arable and Mr. Arable, which is Fern's parents. On chapter 7, we left off on Wilbur feeling really upset about him being killed during Christmas time to be eaten. And I'm thinking that Charlotte is going to find a way to save Wilbur from being killed. Let's go ahead and read chapter 8. Remember, you can pause the video at any time if you need to see and write down the big ideas. Your paper should look just like my board does. One side that has big idea, the other side that has text evidence. Here's our big idea. Mrs. Arable feels worried about Fern because she doesn't think it's normal for her to talk about talking animals. She wants to talk to the doctor so she knows that Fern is okay. So we're going to find our text evidence about what Miss Arable feels and believes to be true about Fern. I am on chapter 8, A Talk at Home. On Sunday morning, Mr. and Mrs. Arable and Fern were sitting at breakfast in the kitchen. Avery had finished and was upstairs looking for his slingshot. Did you know that Uncle Homer's gooselings had hatched? Asked Fern. How many? Asked Mr. Arable. 7, replied Fern. There were 8 eggs, but one didn't hatch, and the old goose told Templeton she didn't want it anymore, so he took it away. The goose did what? Asked Mrs. Arable, gazing at her daughter with a queer, worried look. Told Templeton she didn't want the egg anymore, repeated Fern. Who is Templeton? Said Mrs. Arable. He's the rat, replied Fern. None of us like him that much. Who is us? Said Mr. Arable. Oh, everybody in the barn cellar. Wilbur and the sheep and the lambs and the goose and the gander and the gooselings and Charlotte and me. Charlotte? Said Mrs. Arable. I saw on the first page that it said that Mrs. Arable was looking at Charlotte with a queer look. I'm wondering why she has that expression on her face when she's looking at Fern. I know that Fern is telling her parents that she's having conversations or she's hearing conversations about the animals talking. But I know in real life that animals don't talk. So I'm wondering what Mrs. Arable is thinking about Fern. She's Wilbur's best friend. She's terribly clever. What does she look like? Said Mrs. Arable. Well, said Fern. She has 8 legs. All spiders do, I guess. Charlotte is a spider? Asked Fern's mother. Fern nodded. A big gray one. She has a web across the top of Wilbur's doorway. She catches flies and sucks their blood. Wilbur adores her. Does he really? Said Mrs. Arable, rather vaguely. She was staring at Fern with a worried expression on her face. Oh, yes. Wilbur adores Charlotte, said Fern. Do you know what Charlotte said when the gooselings hatched? I haven't the faintest idea, said Mr. Arable. Tell us. Well, when the first gooseling stuck his little head out from under the goose, I was sitting on my stool in the corner and Charlotte was on her web. She made a speech. She said, I am sure every one of us here in the barn cellar would be gratified to learn that after 4 weeks of unremitting effort and patience on the part of the goose, she now has something to show for it. Don't you think that was a pleasant thing for her to say? Yes, I do, said Mrs. Arable. And now, Fern, it's time to get ready for Sunday school. And tell Avery to get ready. And this afternoon, you can tell me more about what goes on at your Uncle Homer's barn. Aren't you spending quite a lot of time there? You go there almost every afternoon, don't you? I like it there, replied Fern. She wiped her mouth and ran upstairs. After she had left the room, Mrs. Arable spoke to her husband. I worry about Fern, she said. Did you hear the way she rambled on about those animals, pretending that they talked? I found that my first piece of evidence is on page 54. So scholars, get your pencils ready to make sure that you're writing down the page number and your quotation marks. Page 54. My first piece of evidence that talks about how Miss Arable feels and what she wants to do. I worry about Fern. And I'm taking this evidence right from the book. Did you hear the way she rambled about the animals? Gonna make sure I write all of that. Did you hear how she rambled about those animals? Pretending they talked. This is the evidence to support how Miss Arable feels that she's worried about Fern because she doesn't think it's normal for her to talk about animals. Let's see if we can find another piece of evidence that talks about what Miss Arable wants to do. Mr. Arable chuckled. Maybe they do talk, he said. I've sometimes wondered. At any rate, don't worry about Fern. She's just got a lively imagination. Kids think they hear all sorts of things. Just the same, I do worry about her, replied Mrs. Arable. I think I should ask Dr. Dorian about her next time I see him. He loves Fern almost as much as we do. I want him to know how queerly she is acting about a pig and everything. I don't think it's normal. You know perfectly well animals don't talk. Mr. Arable grinned. Maybe our ears aren't as sharp as Fern's, he said. So I found my second piece of evidence that's going to go under what Mrs. Arable wants to do. It is still on page 54. I'm going to put my page number, page 54, and my quotation marks. I think I shall ask Dr. Dorian and my evidence is coming right from the book. I want him to know how queerly, that means different, how queerly she is acting about that pig. She is acting about that pig. So I'm noticing here that Mrs. Arable is thinking that Fern, something might be a little wrong with Fern because she's thinking that the animals is talking. But if we look at our second big idea, it says Mr. Arable isn't worried about Fern. He thinks that she's acting like a normal kid and using her imagination. I know some of you use your imagination. He thinks that is a little bit funny. So I know that Mrs. Arable and Mr. Arable have two different perspectives. I know that Mrs. Arable feels worried, and we know that Mr. Arable isn't worried, and he thinks it's a little funny. I want you to find that text evidence to support about Mr. Arable not being worried that Fern is using her imagination. Capiche? Go to work.